Hi, Michael.
Hi, Chris. How are you?
Good. It's great to be on with you doing another Blogging Heads. I guess this is your first, huh?
It is my initial Blogging Heads adventure.
Yeah, and it's great that we're here to talk about your new book, Denialism. You and I have already done a Slate dialogue about it, so hopefully we'll be able to refer to that. I'm holding up the book. You can't see it, but it's got my tacky Post-it notes. I'm a Post-it note obsessive, and I've got different color Post-it notes, so I've really read it carefully, and I very much enjoyed it. So I'm looking forward to discuss it with you.
Me too.
Let's start in. Denialism as a concept. It seems to be, I'm hearing it more and more, and I'm not sure why that is. Where does it come from, and how come it's coming on so strong?
You know, I first started writing about denialism when I wrote about AIDS denialism some time ago in South Africa. But the way I use it is to just sort of blanketly refer to a group of people who look at data, look at facts, look at studies, and nonetheless turn their back on that because it's more comfortable to do so. It's sort of a society version of denial, and we've all been in denial, and maybe it's normal to be in denial from time to time, but there's a real lot of harm that can be done when you do this on a larger national level.
Okay. And reading your book, I did get the sense that, you know, there is all kinds of denial out there, and there's global warming denial, evolution denial. I've been blogging this week about Einstein relativity denial.
I missed
and
that one.
Shakespeare denial. You know, the people who say that Shakespeare isn't from Stratford. He's from Oxford. He's the Duke of Oxford. That kind of stuff. So there's a lot of different kinds of denial.
True.
Your definition seems to me to go farther in some respects, though, doesn't it? And a little bit broader?
Yeah, I think so, because I think it is a broader category than just saying this guy didn't write Shakespeare's plays, or even that the theory of relativity isn't the way we know it to be. Mm-hmm. I just see, really I'm focusing on America, but it's also true in other places. I see a country that's just sort of really struggling with the truth on a whole bunch of levels, and it's difficult to understand. I have a few ideas, and it's very damaging, and I'd like to try and have us just call it by a name. And if we call it by a name, maybe we can start to reverse it.
Mm-hmm. There is one objection. I don't know if you've heard this, but you get it particularly in the global warming arena, where the word denier has been used a lot to refer to those who, question the idea that humans are driving the warming trend. And the objection from the, quote, denier, or I guess they'd prefer to be called skeptics, is that in just using that term, you're invoking the full weight of the Holocaust, because there's a Holocaust denier as a concept, and that's a known concept. Do you think that that's a fair objection?
I don't really, for a variety of reasons. One is I think words evolve. I think AIDS denialism is extremely commonly used and has been for a long time, and in fact, the president of South Africa, for the first time ever 2 weeks ago, stood up and said we have to defeat AIDS denialism. So I don't, to me I make a distinction between something like the Holocaust and the Holocaust denial, which is so outrageous and horrific. A lot of the denialism I deal with are things that you can kind of understand why people begin to question these things and have problems. And I think they're much more amenable to rational solutions. I don't think you can convince a guy who doesn't believe the Holocaust happened that it did. And I don't think you can convince people who think our ancestors rode around on dinosaurs that they didn't.
So where can we more convince people? Maybe we can start in. There's some broader things I want to bring up some of the things we talked about on Slate, but maybe just give me an example where you think folks are more amenable to persuasion.
Well, I like to think the vaccine issue is one, and the vaccine issue gets screamed out a lot, and particularly now because of swine flu. But part of the reaction to vaccines is simply because most of the diseases that they prevent don't exist anymore in our world. So I got an email from someone I went to college with the other day saying, I wouldn't give my child a polio vaccine because there's no polio around here. That's sort of true, but it's also true that the longest flight you can take in the world is shorter than the shortest incubation time for disease. So if somebody has polio and gets on a plane in Nigeria and gets off the plane in Chicago, he may not know it, and the people he infects may not know it, and that hasn't happened. But the idea that it won't happen or can't happen is crazy. These things can come back.
So you think that if diseases start coming back, I guess that will convince people.
It will. I mean, I hate to see it come to that, but I think, yes, if we have a little pocket of polio in this country, I think it would be difficult to deny that we ought to use the remarkable preventive that we have.
Mm-hmm. So in that sense, vaccine denial is kind of a decadence that we can afford, or at least some people think we can afford.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to sit down and say everything we do entails some risk. And so people can look at a vaccine and say, well, maybe there's a risk in this vaccine, however small. They don't say, gee, what's the risk of not getting the vaccine? Or what's the risk of getting in a car or not getting in a car? What's the risk of having dinner tonight? And I don't blame them for not saying that. I don't blame people for getting on a plane and saying, thank God, U.S. Airlines flew 19 million miles without an accident last year. Mm-hmm. But I do think we need to develop some understanding that there are kind of more dimensions to these issues than the one that might be the most comfortable to look at.
Well, the vaccine issue is interesting to me. I've written about it, too. I did a Discover piece about it. I alluded to it in our recent book, Unscientific America. Didn't go into detail there, but it's come on strong in the last 10 years. It's newer. I mean, there's a long history going back to, the 16th century, 17th century or something, of people not liking, from the invention of vaccination.
Benjamin Franklin was a big opponent of the smallpox vaccine, as was his brother, who was the editor of the first daily newspaper in this country. Yeah. And Franklin's 4-year-old son died of smallpox, and he wrote very eloquently in his autobiography about what a mistake that was. And, this has gone on for a long time, and it's not going to disappear overnight. But there are little events that seem to spike it, and obviously the event that we're dealing with lately is the rise in the rate of autism and the persistent belief that there is some relationship between vaccination and autism, even though there is no. This is one of the things that has been tested so, I won't say completely because one's never done testing, but quite thoroughly. And there's never been a correlation shown.
No, I got you on that. But what's interesting about it, and this is something that we brought up on Slate a little, is, this is the last 10 years with the Demersal autism argument. There are earlier incarnations of vaccine opposition. But, I think, this is my experience, I think that there's something about the web providing a new way for people who think that the vaccine injured, their little child, and it's devastating when, you have a kid who's warm and affectionate and suddenly stops being, and the first signs of autism are showing up. They all get together and they share stories and they cluster and ratify one another's anecdotal experience. And I think that that's sort of helping to create the phenomenon. What do you think about that?
I think you're right. I think the internet is a very complicated factor in all of this because, as I always say, and I think I said in the Slate conversation with you, the internet is a remarkable net good. And we get so much information that we didn't have and so much opportunity that we didn't have. But it is also true that you can find evidence to support any supposition you have about anything in the world on the internet. And sometimes it looks kind of official. If you have a wacky idea about vaccines or anything else, believe me, you'll be able to dig it out of the internet. And it becomes difficult for people who genuinely want to know answers to try to decide, well, who am I supposed to believe here?
And Jenny McCarthy has famously or infamously said that she learned about vaccines from the University of Google.
Yeah, she did. And I love Google, but she should go to graduate school.
Yeah, totally. Well, but I think that it's not just, follow me on this thought, it's not just the availability of misinformation and the availability of information. Because National Science Foundation figures show that people are definitely going to the web, where they might have pulled an encyclopedia off the shelf. Now they're definitely Googling to get scientific information. But it's also the clustering effect, because the web fractions the audience into all these little tiny groups, and everybody goes to the places that they like the information. And so you go to the anti-vaccine place and you get riled up.
I think that's true if you have a predisposition to do that.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are just kind of honestly looking for information. And if they type in vaccine, they're going to get the National Vaccine Information Center, which looks kind of official and maybe governmental, except that it's one of the great opponents of universal vaccination. And it's really hard to know. I mean, sure, if you're someone who's opposed, you're going to go to those websites and you're going to be delighted in support. But I think of the great middle ground of people who just want answers. And they feel, and this is part of why there is denialism and why it's something that's understandable, I think a lot of people in this country feel disappointed in, let down by, even lied to by drug companies, government officials, medical officials. Some of this is quite legitimate, and I would argue that some is not, but you do have this pervasive mistrust.
Mm-hmm. Well, that gets into, I want to talk about the specific case studies that you use in the book, because there's some ways they're surprising, but in a good way, case studies. But, I don't think we've totally exhausted this broad theme of America and its relationship with science, which is obviously something that consumes me as well, and just what it is that makes people act this way, as best we can discern it. We're not psychologists. There's something psychological going on with people, clinging to preconceptions and being unwilling to let them go. But the point I want to raise is that, they don't profess, Americans in surveys, they don't profess to hate science. They don't profess to be anti-science. They don't know a lot about science. They don't have it on the radar, but they have these good, warm, fuzzy feelings. So how does that nevertheless transfer into denialism?
Well, I think people do answer questions as if they trust scientists and they trust science. But when they are actually asked to do something that involves making a choice, they so often retreat into denialism. So, and I use lots of examples in the book, but food is one, vitamins are another. The knee-jerk reflexive response is to walk away from mountains of data and look at the thing that makes you comfortable, the thing you think you know, the thing that sometimes intuitively makes sense. That's true with the vaccine thing. You have a beautiful child developing normally, suddenly he goes haywire, and you say, what happened? What happened about that time? And yes, usually vaccines happened about that time, but there's a difference between a correlation, as you know, and a causation.
Yeah.
And we've studied that so much, and I think people just don't, they always give more credence to their evidence, to the evidence of their experience, than to, a stack of information. And that's understandable, but I think we need to do a better job of making people see why that might not be the best approach.
But they don't, I think people do that, but there's also, and this is not necessarily the average person who's concerned about vaccines, but there's also, beyond just confusing correlation and causation as an individual might do, there's an elaborate ideological superstructure that gets created to support the anti-science position, and a lot of people spend a lot of time and energy and even write books to rationalize all this.
You're right.
So
you're absolutely right, but I'm beginning to think that some of that, if you look at the anti-science stuff, and we'll probably take this in order, but one of the things I often hear about genetically engineered food when people scream at me about it, which they love to do, often what they're screaming about is their feelings about great international corporate conglomerates and whether they would have a vice grip on these technologies. And, putting aside whatever views I have, because they're complex, I think, that isn't the technology. We're talking about science. We're not talking about corporations. If we think corporations aren't handling a technology right, let's change it. We don't stop using airplanes if we don't like Air France. Mm-hmm. This book has only been out a week, but I've been on a lot of radio shows, and you do get a certain repetitive opposition that doesn't want to listen to the words that are coming out of your mouth.
Well, I'd be very interested. I do want to talk about your specific case studies, GMOs. We've pretty much done vaccines, but tell me what is the radio caller repetitive response? Because every book gets that. The questions sort of start to fall into a number of categories that you get repeatedly. What do you get the most?
Well, on the food stuff, you get, because my argument here is that genetically engineered food has been around for 33 years and is safe. It's as safe as food can be. That doesn't mean there aren't risks. It doesn't mean we know everything. But we do know that after 2 billion acres having been planted, no one has been made sick from it. So people call and they just say, you don't know what you're talking about. This is going too far. Nature shouldn't be treated this way. And then they talk about pesticide use. And pesticide use is a very serious issue that one would need to deal with. But it is actually a separate issue from how you breed plants. Mm-hmm. And so it's very difficult to disentangle them. And then they always say, you hate organic food. And I buy organic food. I eat organic food. It's fine for us to do that. My big argument is that the billions of people in the world who can't afford this kind of food are going to die. And I should say, because this is another thing people accuse me of, it is not my belief. I'm sure that science, genetically engineered technologies or any other, they aren't going to solve this problem. But they can help solve this problem. And we need them. And without them, we're not going to solve it. That's my view.
Yeah, totally. Well, let's unpack GMOs a bit. I wrote about this one, I don't know when, like 5 years ago, and I sort of haven't picked it up since then. But it is the case, right, that in the United States, we've accepted the fact that there are GMOs in our food supply in a fairly docile way compared to some of the European countries, right? I mean,
that's absolutely true, but I think some things are changing there because you're seeing more and more opposition. And the thing that bothers me about this opposition, it sort of posits organic food against genetically engineered food, and I think that's a kind of silly comparison. I don't know why genetically engineered food couldn't be raised in the same way that organic food is raised, and make organic farmers pleased with it. There's technically no reason because all food is genetically modified. So we are seeing a bit of slippage there, but no, it isn't like Europe where they're just, they are, I think the word hysterical is not wrong to use.
And they have a different relationship with food. They have the history of mad cow, which made everybody extremely paranoid about the food supply, rightly so. I mean, maybe that's...
Well, you're right. I actually have changed my position. I've always said labeling genetically modified foods is silly because it's just food. I actually am now changing my position. I think we should label it all. I think everyone should understand that 82% of what they eat is genetically modified and has been for decades. And let people, maybe people need to really see how prevalent it is to understand that this is a part of life that we can accept with little horrific doubt.
Yeah. Well, let me ask one more thing about GMOs again, because in my book Republican War on Science, I've taken to task Republicans, conservatives, but I wanted to show that there was sort of left-wing issues with science, and I used GMOs as an example. And I said one of the things they say, and I was like pointing at Greenpeace, that's factually wrong, is they say that these things are risky, to human health. And I said that's wrong. And you've agreed with me on that. Another thing they say, which might not be as wrong as I understand it based on 4 years ago research, is there might be some environmental impact in the sense that, something you plant that is different and new could have some sort of ecological interaction and get out of control. What about that concern?
That is an absolutely legitimate concern. And people who say there's no reason to worry about that are just, they're denialists too. But I think, again, it's like with the vaccine issue. We know how to contain that. There have been lots of studies on how to keep species from intermingling.
Yeah.
It's not easy to happen. Wild species don't easily mix with other types. And again, the idea that somehow there's chemicals and pesticides, organic food has that too. But yes, environmental issues are real, but they're real with all food, and we need to deal with them and not walk away just because there is a measurable small risk, which there is to everything we do.
Yeah. No. Well, I think I'm in agreement with you on all this stuff, so I'm definitely in agreement with you on that one.
But that's another thing I'm attacked for a lot, which is the environmental element. And I agree there's an environmental element here of risk. We just need to assess it adequately, which I actually think we have because we plant billions of acres of it, and treat it properly with pesticide. Let's not forget that insecticide use has just dropped dramatically as a result of genetically modified foods because you can target what you want to target. And you're seeing millions of pounds a year of insecticide not being used. So the idea, I've never really understood, and actually the World Wildlife Fund just came out tentatively saying, yeah, maybe this biotechnology stuff would help with world hunger. I've never understood why environmentalists are so reflexively opposed to it.
I think they split, though, don't they? I mean, you get the Greenpeace Friend of the Earth crowd that really, doesn't like this stuff. But sort of in the U.S., the mainline environmental groups that I think of would probably not want to pick a fight on this.
I totally agree, but what they won't do is stand up and argue for it. And I think that needs to be done. I think it really does need to be done. And it needs to be done by, NRDC and the environmentalists that people respect.
Yeah, totally. No, I think that that's right, and I think that, of course, the reason is going to be that probably a lot of people who, are members of these organizations do have the stronger position.
Yeah, you're right. But again, and maybe I'm naive and utopian here, but I think it's the jobs of leaders, whether of countries or organizations, to put out information that's accurate and bring their membership along. We now are starting to live in a country where everything is poll tested. It's backwards. We're supposed to have leaders. We're supposed to have intelligence and let them make a case. And then we can say, you're full of crap or not. But let's not just wait till the lowest common denominator tells us what to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've done vaccines and we've done GMOs, and they have something in common to me in the sense that when you look at who doesn't like the science on the issue, it tilts left. It's clearly politically, it's sort of the bi-coastal liberal elites who feel this way, with maybe a little bit in the middle, but mostly, it's blue America that's worried about these things. There are also, red America has its science issues as well, evolution and things like that. Your book mainly focuses on the blue America ones. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. You mentioned this when I spoke up with you guys at MIT, and to be quite honest, I hadn't looked at it that way before. But I guess the reason that I focused on these issues, and people who know me or have read anything I've written would not consider me part of Red America. But these issues are things that I think are really profoundly important, and we can move them. And maybe I'm wrong, I just don't think I went down to the Creation Museum when I was working on my book with the intention of writing a chapter about it, and I just thought, what would I contribute? What would that chapter say? That this is wrong? We have Richard Dawkins, we have excellent science writers who have written about this, and no matter how wonderful the writing is, and no matter how definitive, you're not budging these people. So I kind of felt like, let's fight battles that maybe we could, if not win, move a few inches in the right direction. And that did turn out to be, blue state ones. And maybe I should have thought about that.
Well, maybe not all of them. I don't know. But you're right. Evolution has been beaten to death. There are so many. I mean, there are people who spend all their time refuting the creationist / intelligent design creationist nonsense. There are shelf loads of books that set the record straight.
But the thing about the creationism thing that is, at some level, they can always say, we can say whatever we want about the history of this planet and of molecular biology and what it tells us, and then they'll just say, but at some point something had to start it. And it's you can't prove a negative. It's sort of like with the vaccine stuff. We can't prove that a shot didn't cause autism. We can only point to the millions of cases where the rates are the same whether you got a shot or not. You cannot prove a negative. And it's very hard to get into that battle. And I guess I just thought with that, and also with global warming, I couldn't make a contribution that would add to the debate.
Yeah, well, I mean, I understand what you're saying there, because, again, there's such a volume of stuff, and the positions are so entrenched. I've pointed out many times that the global warming, the evolution polling figures in terms of what percent of the United States is
crazy.
A creationist. They don't move. They don't change. They're static. And exactly why that is, I mean, I certainly would have some thoughts on it. But it's true. It's been that way for a long, long time. So it's good to take on some other some other
Yeah,
things.
that's the other thing. I thought these are issues that we all deal with. I mean, everyone deals with food every day, which is one reason everyone has reacted when I talk about this. People deal with vitamins and big pharma, which is something I write about, and they have to face the issue of vaccines for their children. And these are things they confront every day. And I thought maybe that would be of more value than talking. Global warming, one guy reviewed my book and had many criticisms, but he said the biggest criticism was that I sort of didn't address global warming. I say flat out in the book that it's the greatest threat ever faced by humanity. I don't know how much more I could stake a position or more clearly, but I didn't write a chapter on it, and I chose not to do that for the reasons I just discussed. I just didn't think there would be any value in it.
That's legit, and I saw that in the book. Actually, I saw that it was the Grist review I think you're referring to, and I saw that review, and then I read your book, and I was like, well, it's clear that he knows that global warming is a big problem, and he knows that there's denial on this. He just isn't doing the number. So, I didn't think that was a big, valid criticism of any sort.
No, but it was interesting to me.
Well, let's try some of the other topics, because again, you pick really interesting ones, and we've done GMOs, we've done to some extent organics, and we've done vaccines. Well, tell me about Vioxx, because
Vioxx,
yeah, it's a case where I would have thought that that Merck is the problem, right? I mean,
well, Merck is. This is another thing where I've been criticized, and it amuses me tremendously. I put that chapter in the book, and it's the first chapter of the book, because I wanted to make it clear that reasons for denialism are not in name, usually. There are reasons. They're legitimate, and we need to deal with them. And Vioxx is the best example I can think of that. So for anyone who was a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory that could treat arthritis pain without the sort of gastrointestinal side effects that aspirin often causes. And a lot of people just can't take that much aspirin, and they're in agony. So along came Vioxx. Fantastic, took care of the pain, the stomach was fine. It was miraculous, except that people started having heart attacks. And many people had heart attacks and strokes. We're talking about thousands of deaths. And it turned out that there was a cardiovascular risk profile here that was elevated, and Merck knew about it. And they pushed this drug, until Viagra came along. This was the most heavily advertised drug in American history. And, Merck has done many good things, but it is shameful what they did with this drug. Shameful. And people needed to know the truth, and they didn't know the truth. And believe me, if you're in a lot of pain, you want to go to your doctor, and you don't want to hear bad things. You just want to get the cool new drug. The other reason I included Vioxx is very important, which is I'm trying to talk about risk in this book. And in the end, Vioxx was taken off the market, and it killed as many people as American soldiers died in Vietnam, 55,000.
Crazy.
It is crazy. It is devastating. But I would argue that drug should be on the market today. And I'll tell you why. Because if you prescribe it properly to people who do not have cardiovascular risk issues, and it's easy to know this stuff with cholesterol measurements and heart attack family histories, you end up having a kind of 1 in 100, 1 in 150 chance of having a problem if you take this for a couple years every day. Now, for a lot of people who are in agony, if you go up to them and say, you're going to have a 1 in 100 chance of having a heart attack and dying, they're going to say, fine, give me the pill. But it became so black and white that it just, we've developed a system in this country, and some of it is the pharmaceutical company's fault, where if a drug kills a person, no matter how many it saves or how many lives it improves, it's got to go. If we regulated cars the way we regulate drugs, no American would be allowed to enter one. And so this is a complex thing. And so I'm not arguing in favor of pharmaceutical companies here. I'm arguing in favor of using drugs properly.
And knowing what their risk profile is. I mean, but if they'd put out, would they have been able to get it through the regulatory process if they'd put out the heart attack risk? I mean, because there's certainly
Probably not.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of drugs where we're told it has this side effect, that it's just maybe not that bad of a side effect.
It's just that kind of the system with the FDA is if a drug's approved, a doctor can do what he or she wants. And that just shouldn't be. We should have a better sense, especially now. We know more about drugs. We know more about interactions with other things people take. We know more about our bodies. We ought to start moving in the area of personalization, and we are moving in that area. It's slow, it's coming, but it's really crazy to think that there's a drug that millions of people, literally, could use to great benefit, but it's off the market.
Well, I got you, and it's interesting to know that wrinkle. It's sort of like an abuse followed by an overreaction in everybody's.
Yeah, I mean, I have to stress that.
Yeah.
But because they were so bad, Congress was out for their heads. I mean, Henry Waxman, who I respect profoundly, he wanted to throw them all in the ocean, and I don't blame him. That's what you should do when you're faced with a giant pharmaceutical company that's lying to the American people so it can make more money. Mm-hmm. It's just that, in the end, we probably could have found a better way.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about, you were starting to broach the topic of personalized medicine, and you do this great number at the end of the book on synthetic biology, and there's alternative medicine. So there's all these topics to take on. Why don't you tell us a little bit about personalized medicine and finding out about your own genetic risks and why you think there's a risk of denialism here?
Well, by personalized medicine, I think what I mean and what Chris means is knowing about your genetic status, knowing what is likely to cause disease and what is not. We're in early days in these diagnostic tools. And I took the tests from the companies that offer them. There are several, and I took all the major ones from a company, 23andMe, DecodeMe, and Navigenics. Mm-hmm. And it sort of tells you have genes for this, you don't have genes for that, you have a really high risk of something, you don't. And it's partial information. But it's information. And sometimes it's really useful. And I'll tell you one example, and it applies to me. My father has Alzheimer's disease. There are two alleles on genes called APOE4. If you have two of them, one from each parent, you have the number may be wrong, but it's sort of a 19 times greater risk of developing Alzheimer's than the average person in the population. That's a huge number. It's a scary number. And James Watson, when he had his genome done, asked that be the one piece of information he didn't receive. And he was 79 at the time. But it's understandable. I mean, people are different. I'm not that way. If there's info, I want it. Yeah. So I took the test, and I got the info, and I don't have either allele. And, I danced for joy for about a minute, but I have a really smart physician, and he said, listen, this is great news, but don't forget, Alzheimer's is going to be probably like diabetes. There are going to be 7 causes, 5 causes, all sorts of causes. Yeah. And it turns out that one of the things people talk about these days is the cholesterol tangles that get in your brain. When they do autopsies on Alzheimer's patients, they often see those tangles. So my physician and some friends in Washington said, you ought to think about taking a statin, even though I didn't really have high cholesterol, because just on the chance that it would prevent this or delay it, there doesn't seem to be a downside for most people, because millions of us take this drug, and it does, however, have one downside, which is that you can get terrible muscle pains from it. And I had the gene for terrible muscle pains. So, it's a very complicated thing. It turns out that I don't have the muscle pains. I took the drug. But this information is getting better and better and better. It's going to tell you what drugs are more likely to work properly in your body. And we're kind of at stage 1 in a 100-stage process. But it's an exciting time. And people are really very afraid of it, and they're sort of saying, we should not have this information, we should not be allowed to use this information. And I don't understand that. I don't think every person should be forced to have this. I don't think any person should be forced to have it.
Well, it's expensive still, right?
It's expensive, but with the numbers are dropping. I think it started out being 1,000 or more. I think it's 300-400 now, and it'll keep falling. George Church, who teaches at Harvard, has predicted that one of these days we'll have our entire genome on our iPhone, and we'll just walk into a store and it'll remind us that we shouldn't get those eggs because we have high cholesterol and we got 4 eggs earlier in the week.
And you can scan another person, right, and you can see if they're genetically compatible with you and whether you want to ask them out just by running your iPhone over.
That's true. That gets a little scary. I mean, but yes, it is true.
Oh, maybe that would take a little bit more work.
I just got an email today about some software service that checks people out before you go on dates for.
Yeah, that's definitely part of this whole. It's not personalized medicine, but it's as we are able to, in an affordable way, scan genes quicker.
So this is the thing that I think makes people crazy. If you saw the movie Gattaca, so at one point Ethan Hawke, or I guess Uma takes a hair out of her head and gives it to him to have it genetically tested to see if she was appropriate for him. And this all seemed kind of like science fiction 8 years ago. It's not at all science fiction now, and there are real downsides to it. It's not just purely wonderful. But there are, and again, this is true with so many of these issues I deal with in the book, people want to sort of paint everything with one whole brush. Either it's great or it's terrible. The truth is, most things are valuable but complicated, and we need to figure out how to use these technologies properly. I just don't know why the answers has started to be in this country, let's walk away from something that's so promising.
Well, I mean, I love Gattaca. I think everybody should see Gattaca, and I don't think it's an anti-science movie. I think it's sort of right on. I don't know how many people watch it. I don't think it grossed that much, at the box office. But do you think we're going to walk away, though? I mean, I don't think you can put this, back in the box.
I hope you're right. But let me ask you something, because someone asked me this the other day. And they said, well, do you think we should be able to genetically program our children to be healthier and have certain traits? And I said, well, all my friends have LASIK surgery, and so they can see better. I didn't get LASIK surgery because my corneas are too thin. I failed the pre-LASIK test. So the question is, if we could do that on a genetic level for our kids and our progeny, would that be wrong? Would it be wrong if we could make sure that people don't die early of heart disease? It's a slippery slope. Where do you draw the line between sort of a master race and a minor race? Yeah. But I can't imagine that some of these things would be rejected.
I can't either. I mean, the incentive is too strong. I don't know what the real question is, when is there going to be something that people deem to be too much, too far, and there's going to be an outcry or backlash?
Well, that's going to happen. Yeah. And one of the things that you and I talked about in the Slate dialogue is what I believe you probably think is utopian desire to get America prepared for that.
Yeah.
And do you want to talk about that now, or do you?
Yeah, tell us the utopian plan.
Well, to me, I think we're on the verge of a really exciting time in the history of science and in life with synthetic biology. And we can create artificial organisms that can do some wonderful things. And for instance, some folks under Jay Kiesling out in California have created artificial artemisinin, which is the main malaria drug. They're going to be able to make all the malaria medicine in the world in a vat. Right now, that drug is made by a painstaking process. It's grown on thousands of farms in Africa and India and Asia. It's the weather plays a role, the crops, the water, the sun. We can eliminate those elements, and it will be so much. It's just remarkable. It will also be very cheap and very easy to control the quality, which are two things that are not true now. Yeah. That's an example of something that I think can work. People are working on doing this with sources of energy. They're not at stage one, but they're not all the way down yet. And I do think we're at the point pretty soon where we're going to be able to create something that doesn't burn greenhouse gases and makes our cars go around and makes our factories work. And those are tremendously valuable.
And these are little bugs, right? I mean, they're,
You're basically creating bugs from chemical constituent parts. And it is also really scary because you're making new organisms from scratch. I wrote a story in the New Yorker a couple years ago about these people who were bringing extinct viruses back to life, and called endogenous retroviruses. They're parts of dead viruses. We all have them in our body. Some people just started putting them back together, stitching them together, and making them infectious again. People think it's nuts to do that. But what they're trying to do is if you can build a virus, you can take it apart. And so there's a guy in Long Island called Eckhard Wimmer who made a fake polio virus. And people denounced him for that. But what he was really doing, and what he's been doing ever since, is creating a situation where we can rapidly make DNA vaccines for things like polio. And if a new virus, a pandemic, flu, something horrific comes, we really ought to have the intellectual know-how now to take that on a molecular level and build a vaccine instantly. We're growing H1N1 in a zillions of eggs like we did during World War II. Surely we ought to be able to use the tools we have to move beyond something that was 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Well, but eventually, I mean, there's going to be this fear. We had this fear with Nano, but again, it didn't really catch on.
That's
Michael
true.
Crichton tried to stoke it, with his novel Prey. I mean, of the little machine running out of control and turning everything into gray goo. And I guess we're going to have that same fear with the little bug that we've created.
See, what I argue for in the book, and I think you think it's utopian and dreamerish, is let's have a national conversation about this now. I don't think we ever did with genetically modified foods. I think we developed it, scientists implemented it, and that's also been true of lots of scientific discoveries in our lives, trains, telegraph. We didn't have a national conversation about those. But these things are more important, and they're more fundamental, and it makes us feel weird to be sitting here talking about building new life forms and altering the constituent elements of life. And it ought to make us feel weird. It's a very bizarre thing that we're going to be able to do, but I think we need to talk about the benefits and the risks on a really high level. And I don't see why that can't be done. I don't see why this particular presidential administration can't be convinced that those issues are among the most important issues we've ever faced.
Mm-hmm. And I don't want to say it's impossible. I just want to say that you have to have someone who convinces the president to do this, and then you have to have a week when there are no fires to put out.
It's pushing the boulder uphill, but I know that you're willing to try and push it up with me. And I just think we should try to do that. I don't think it's crazy. I really don't. There was a conference in 1975 at the beginning of the era of molecular biology in Asimilare, California, that sort of did these things. But it was mostly scientists, and they mostly got together because they were saying, gee, these technologies are weird. We can actually move genes from one sort of organism to another, and that could have some effects. What do we do? And they were very controlled and sophisticated about trying to regulate their field. And I give them a lot of credit. But I think we're beyond that now. I think it can't be something that scientists control. It has to be something controlled by the people who run our country.
Yeah, I think that the press is not going to just, you'll write about it, but I don't see, TV mass media just thinking out of the goodness of their hearts that they'll, help prepare us for this. So,
no, that's true. It would have to be a kind of bandwagon thing. And so we'd have to get some key people to start screaming about it. And I think we'd also have to be able to say, look at this organism, we're going to put it in this vat, and we're going to have cheap diesel fuel that doesn't cause greenhouse, and you'll be able to put it in your car. We're going to have some sort of very powerful, positive product so that people can relate to it. But I do think that's coming.
Well, it's probably fairly far off still, though.
Well, it's not far off in principle. Those products exist now. It's very difficult to scale it up. It costs a lot of money, and it's going to... far off, I don't know, 3-5 years.
Huh. Well, sometimes the technology is overpromised, but I agree. I'm afraid of the moment, you are too, when everybody yells Frankenstein.
Yeah, well, they've been yelling Frankenstein for a long time, but now they're actually maybe going to have the right to yell Frankenstein.
Well, right. This is more Frankenstein than anything that Frankenstein has been yelled about before. This is finally maybe a good analogy.
And I do think that that one element of this is that we have promised so much. I think it's one important element of denialism. Science is, we're going to cure cancer, we're going to solve the problems of water, we're going to take salt out of the ocean, we're going to do everything, it's going to be great. And we don't do everything because it's more complicated than that. Not only that, we have Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and Karen Ann Quinlan and DES and, name your tragedy. There are lots of examples of industrial life and scientific progress doing really bad things to people. And we have to remember that and acknowledge it. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we do enough, actually.
Right, and so it all comes down to benefits and risks, and of course, people without enough time on their hands, hopefully assessing these in a fairly sophisticated way. And that's the problem.
It is a problem, but I think if you get back even to vaccines, so out there in Marina del Rey, California, they got 40% of their kids not getting vaccinated. So what's going to happen? I promise you, there are going to be measles epidemics, and people will eventually die. It's just a numbers issue. And I don't want to say, gee, maybe we need people to die, but these things are really very significant, and we need to start focusing not just on... It's very comfortable to look inward, to look at our neighbor, to sort of embrace what we think we know. It doesn't help. It doesn't help you, and it doesn't help me, and we need to start talking about that more. One of the things we didn't mention, and I'll just throw it out there, is vitamins.
Yeah.
We gobble vitamins down like there's no tomorrow, but study after study after study after study is showing they're kind of useless. There are exceptions. Vitamin D is one, folic acid for pregnant women, iron. There are exceptions. But in general, all these packets of antioxidants and a cacaberry, it's just crap. It's not doing anything for you. And increasingly, it seems to be interfering with your attempt to be healthy. So this is just, but you know why people, I think, do this? Because pharmaceutical industry is scary, expensive, and unpleasant. Our health system sucks and is unfair. And you can look in a vitamin store and they say it's natural and it feels right. And it just seems to be on a scale that's acceptable. And I understand that. I think that's what a lot of this is. It's things that are on a scale that we understand. But in the end, we're really harming ourselves and we're harming others. Because when you start believing that these magic elixirs are as good as drugs, what you have is Thabo Mbeki, South Africa. And he killed hundreds of thousands of people with garlic and lemon oil instead of using drugs. So these things have real consequences. And
they cost, well, I'm sure the industry is, many $1 billion a year. And there are things like ephedra, which I think you mentioned in the book, where they're actually dangerous.
But the thing about ephedra that was amazing was so they took Vioxx off the market, and I think that was going to have to happen, and it quickly became apparent once they did the proper studies what was going on. Ephedra was a war to get it off the market. Ephedra is so damn dangerous. It kills lots of people. But, you talk about right-wing and left-wing issues, and you're mostly right, except I think here's an exception. The sort of Orrin Hatch, Utah, these people will pick up a rifle if you say, don't let me take my vitamins. And it's actually one of these things where you have the right wing and the kind of remnants of the countercultural left joining together. And it would be funny, except it's a little scary.
There was a wonderful Washington Monthly article from 2003 by Stephanie Mensimer, and it was called, I just remember it because the title was so good, it was called Scorin' with Orrin.
Oh, I didn't read it. I would have remembered.
You should Google Scorin' with Orrin, because it's all about how, letting kids have Spanish fly.
Really?
Yeah, it's a hilarious article. Really, really good on this topic. But I think we've gone on for almost our the time we'd planned.
Yeah,
so
time goes by when you're chatting about denialism.
Yeah, definitely. I wonder if there's anything else you wanna throw out there. I mean, if I was gonna leave with a parting remark, and you can maybe respond to it, is you quoted John Milton to me on Slate, and it was a quote that I hadn't read in a long time, and I forgot that I know it, but it's from Areopagitica, which is his great cry for freedom of thought, and it says, whoever knew truth to lose in a fair battle. In other words, science will eventually win, and I'm cynical, and I question whether that's actually true or whether the battles are ever fair anymore.
You're
why
not
don't you end
cynical.
with
I've read
a
your
hope?
books. You're not cynical. Don't say that. But I understand that this, again, I take the long view. And if you look at the course of human history, truth does win, and it even wins in our century. We're richer, more prosperous. We're living better. We're living longer. We're healthier. And by we, I don't just mean, I'm on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I mean the world, even the poorest among us. Because we're moving forward, because truth does win, because vaccines will prevail, because medicine will be made effective and accessible. And yeah, we're going to take 3 steps back and 4 steps forward, and it's going to be a fight all the way. But I just absolutely believe that in the end truth prevails. And if I didn't believe that, I wouldn't write these things and I'd go to become an orthodontist or something. No knock on orthodontia.
Well, on that note, I think that this has been a great chat.
Yeah, it was great.
It's good to do this, and good luck with the book. I understand it's doing well, so congratulations, Denialism. People check it out. And we'll put up some links.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. This was fun.
It's been great to talk to you.
You too.
Okay, bye-bye.